Jack Reeves looked exactly like what he was supposed to be, a 59-year-old retiree who'd moved to the mountains to get away from city life. He grew vegetables in a small garden, split logs for his wood stove, and occasionally drove to town for supplies in a beat-up pickup truck that had seen better days. The locals knew him as a quiet, polite man who kept to himself and never caused any trouble. What they didn't know was that Jack had spent 23 years hunting the most dangerous drug cartels in North America, or that his retirement's cabin was equipped with more surveillance technology than most police stations. Welcome to True Human Tales. Before we begin this intense story of hidden identity and mountain justice, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. Jack's cabin sat on 47 acres of Colorado wilderness, accessible only by a winding dirt road. He'd chosen the location carefully, remote, defensible, and close enough to civilization for supplies. At 59, Jack had the weathered look of a man who'd spent 5 years working with his hands. His graying beard was neatly trimmed, his clothes practical and worn. To anyone who met him, he appeared to be a retired federal employee who'd saved enough to buy land and live simply. The cabin was modest but well built, with stone fireplace, solar panels, and a workshop. He had a vegetable garden, chicken coop, and small greenhouse. What visitors didn't see were the hidden surveillance cameras, motion sensors, or the reinforced safe room in the basement. They didn't know his hobby radio was sophisticated communication equipment reaching federal agencies, or that his workshop contained weapons and tactical gear. Jack had been Special Agent Jack Reeves, DEA, for 23 years. He'd spent decades undercover in cartel operations, then 13 years as Senior Agent Planning Operations. He'd retired 5 years ago because he was tired of what the work had made him. He'd wanted peace, quiet, and simple life, where the biggest challenge was keeping deer out of his garden. For 5 years, it had worked exactly as planned. Jack had found the peace he'd been looking for in the Colorado mountains, far from cartels and drug dealers and the constant danger that had defined his career. But as he stood in his kitchen that cold February morning, watching 3 armed men approach his cabin through the trees, Jack realized that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, no matter how far into the wilderness you run. The black SUV had been parked on the Forest Service road for 2 days. Jack had been watching the occupants through cameras, noting their patterns and unfamiliarity with mountain terrain. They weren't hunters, wrong season, wrong gear. They weren't hikers. No one hikes in expensive urban clothing with concealed weapons. Jack knew exactly what they were. The 3 men approaching moved with casual confidence. They wore winter coats that poorly concealed shoulder holsters and approached assuming whoever lived there would be easily controlled. Jack watched through his kitchen window while finishing coffee. The leader was Hispanic, mid-30s, with expensive jewelry that screamed cartel money. The other 2 were younger, probably muscle. As they reached his porch, Jack made a decision he'd hoped to avoid. He walked to his bedroom closet and opened a hidden panel. Inside was equipment he hadn't touched since retirement: tactical vest, service weapon, and communication gear. Jack strapped on the vest under his flannel shirt, secured his weapon, and activated his emergency beacon. Then he waited for them to knock. When the knock came, it was polite but firm. Jack opened the door with the demeanor of a curious mountain resident who didn't get many visitors. "Morning," he said, his voice carrying just the right amount of friendly wariness. "Can I help you?" The leader smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Good morning, sir. I'm sorry to bother you, but we're having some car trouble down the road. I was wondering if we could use your phone to call for a tow truck." It was a reasonable cover story, delivered with practiced ease. Jack nodded sympathetically while his trained eye cataloged details. Expensive shoes inappropriate for mountain hiking, bulges under winter coats that indicated concealed weapons, nervous energy that suggested these men were operating outside their comfort zone. "Of course," Jack replied. "Phone's right inside. Come on in." As the 3 men entered his cabin, Jack was already calculating angles, escape routes, and tactical options. 23 years of training don't disappear just because you change your address. Once inside, the polite facade dropped immediately. The leader produced a pistol while his companions flanked Jack, their weapons appearing with practiced efficiency. "Here's what's going to happen, old man," the leader said. You're going to let us use your property for a few days while we conduct business. Keep quiet, stay out of our way, and maybe you live through this." Jack raised his hands, showing exactly the right amount of fear for a harmless retiree. "I don't want trouble. Just take what you want and leave." "Smart, man. We're not here to rob you. We just need a place to store merchandise while we arrange transportation. Your cabin is isolated, nobody comes around, perfect for our needs." Jack nodded, understanding immediately. His property was being used as a drug depot. It was exactly the kind of operation he'd spent 2 decades dismantling. "How long?" Jack asked. "Few days, maybe a week. Depends on transportation." The younger men were checking rooms, securing the perimeter. They moved with military precision, but Jack could see gaps in their technique, corners not properly cleared, tactical mistakes revealing they were experienced, but not expert. "Luis," one called from the bedroom, "this place is bigger than it looks. Got a basement workshop, even some kind of radio setup." Luis smiled at Jack. "Radio setup? You some kind of ham radio operator?" "Just a hobby. Weather reports, talk to other operators." "Well, your talking days are over. Thomas, disable all communication equipment. Carlos, check the perimeter." As the men spread out, Jack was gathering intelligence with systematic thoroughness. 3 armed subjects, experienced but not elite. Temporary operation, probably moving product to smaller distribution points. Luis was in charge but taking orders from someone else. Most importantly, they'd made the same mistake hundreds of criminals had made over the years. They'd underestimated their target. For 6 hours, Jack played the compliant hostage while gathering information. The drug dealers treated him like furniture, present but irrelevant. Luis spent time on the phone, coordinating with contacts about timing and routes. From conversations Jack overheard, this was part of a larger operation, moving significant quantities of cocaine and heroin through Colorado mountains. Tomas had disabled Jack's obvious radio equipment, but the hidden communication system remained active. Jack had already sent coded messages to federal contacts requesting backup. Carlos was the weak link, younger, nervous about unfamiliar territory, clearly his first operation outside urban areas. By afternoon, a truck arrived carrying wooden crates that the men unloaded into Jack's workshop. Jack estimated at least 50 kilograms of drugs, worth millions on the street. But backup was hours away, and Luis was getting suspicious about the isolated location. He kept making comments about how no one would hear gunshots this far from town, and how permanent solutions sometimes became necessary. Jack realized that playing the victim would only work so long. Eventually, these men would decide leaving witnesses was too risky. As the sun set and temperature dropped, Jack made his decision. Time to stop being the victim and start being the agent. Jack made his move during shift change, when Carlos was replacing Thomas on perimeter watch, and Luis was distracted by another phone call. The cabin's lights had been turned off, leaving only fireplace illumination. Jack excused himself to use the bathroom. Instead, he slipped into his bedroom and accessed the hidden weapons cache. Within 30 seconds, he was armed and ready to retake his property. The first target was Carlos on the back porch, smoking and staring nervously into the dark forest. The takedown was silent, professional, and permanent. Thomas was in the workshop checking the drug shipment. Jack approached through the connecting door, moving with tactical precision that had kept him alive through dozens of undercover operations. Thomas was unconscious before he understood what happened. Luis was the real threat, experienced, alert, smart enough to realize something was wrong when his men stopped checking in. Jack found him in the main room, weapon drawn, scanning for threats. "Tomas! Carlos, report!" The silence told Luis everything. Someone had taken out his men. "I know you're there, old man," Luis called into the darkness. "I don't know how you managed this, but you're still outnumbered. I've got backup coming." Jack's response came from the shadows, his voice carrying none of the fear Luis expected. Luis Mendoza, age 34, lieutenant in the Vasquez cartel, wanted by federal authorities in connection with 17 drug trafficking operations. Luis spun toward Jack's voice, trying to locate a target in the darkness. "Who the hell are you?" Jack stepped into the firelight, no longer the harmless mountain hermit, but clearly the federal agent he'd always been. "Special Agent Jack Reeves, DEA, you're under arrest." The look on Luis's face was one of complete shock and disbelief. The harmless old mountain man had been replaced by someone who radiated the kind of controlled authority that comes from decades of law enforcement experience. "That's impossible," Luis said, though his weapon remained trained in Jack's direction. "We checked you out. Jack Reeves, retired federal employee, no criminal record, no law enforcement background." "Classified service record," Jack replied calmly. 23 years undercover operations. You probably would have found it if you'd looked harder, but you made the same mistake most criminals make. You assumed that what you could see was all there was to see." Luis was calculating odds, looking for escape routes, trying to determine if he could take the shot before Jack could return fire. Jack could read the decision-making process in his eyes. It was the same evaluation every cornered criminal went through when they realized their situation had become hopeless. "Here's what's going to happen," Jack continued. "You're going to drop your weapon, put your hands behind your head, and wait for federal backup to arrive. Your friends are already secured. Your drug shipment is evidence, and your operation is completely compromised." "How do I know you really called for backup?" Luis asked, desperation creeping into his voice. As if in answer to his question, the distant sound of helicopters became audible, growing louder as they approached the cabin. Luis's face went pale as he realized that the isolated location he'd thought was perfect for his operation had become a trap. "DEA, FBI, and Colorado State Police," Jack said. "I may be retired, but I still have friends in the business. You picked the wrong cabin, Luis." The helicopters were close now, their searchlights beginning to sweep the forest around the property. Luis looked toward the windows, then back at Jack, his weapon wavering as he realized that resistance was futile. "Drop the weapon," Jack commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd done this hundreds of times before. "It's over." Luis stared at him for another moment, then slowly lowered his pistol and placed it on the floor. As he raised his hands, Jack could see the moment when the reality of his situation fully sank in. He'd been outmaneuvered by a man he'd dismissed as a harmless target. The federal response team that landed in Jack's clearing 20 minutes later found a scene that was tactically perfect and operationally complete. 3 suspects secured, significant drug evidence cataloged, and a retired agent who'd handled the entire situation with textbook precision. Agent Sarah Mitchell, Jack's former partner and current DEA regional supervisor, was among the first through the door. She found Jack sitting calmly at his kitchen table, drinking coffee and reading a book, as if armed drug dealers hadn't been using his cabin as a depot for the past day. "Jack," she said, shaking her head with a mixture of admiration and disbelief, "I should have known when we got your emergency signal that you'd have the situation handled before we arrived." "They made it easy," Jack replied with a slight smile. "Overconfident, underprepared, and operating in terrain they didn't understand. Reminded me of that operation we ran in Guatemala back in '98. Agent Mitchell looked around the cabin, noting the tactical efficiency with which the suspects had been neutralized and secured. "Luis Mendoza has been on our priority list for 2 years. His organization moves more than $100 million worth of drugs annually. This is going to take down their entire Colorado operation." "Good," Jack said simply. "Maybe now I can get back to my retirement." As the federal agents processed the crime scene and prepared to transport the suspects, Jack returned to his normal routine with the same calm demeanor he'd maintained throughout the crisis. He fed his chickens, checked his vegetable garden, and began planning repairs for the minor damage the drug dealers had caused to his workshop. The media attention that followed was significant, but brief. Retired DEA agent Foyle's major drug operation made national news for a few days, then faded as other stories took its place. Jack declined all interview requests and returned to his quiet mountain life as quickly as possible. But word spread through law enforcement communities about the agent who'd never really retired, who'd chosen a remote cabin that turned out to be the perfect trap for criminals who thought they'd found an easy target. 6 months later, Jack's life had returned to its peaceful rhythm. He'd reinforced his security systems, updated his communication equipment, and added a few tactical improvements to his property that would make future intrusions even more difficult. The vegetable garden was thriving, the chickens were laying regularly, and his workshop had been restored to its previous condition. To any casual observer, Jack Reeves looked exactly like what he was supposed to be. A quiet retiree enjoying a simple life in the mountains. but federal agencies across the region now had Jack's contact information in their emergency databases. His remote cabin had become an unofficial safe house for operations requiring mountain expertise, and every few months he received visits from agents seeking advice on cartel operations or wilderness tactical situations. Jack had tried to retire from law enforcement, but law enforcement, it seemed, wasn't quite ready to retire from him. He kept Agent Mitchell's business card on his refrigerator, next to a grocery list and a photo of his garden, just in case anyone else made the mistake of thinking that the quiet mountain man was as harmless as he appeared. Some men leave their careers behind when they retire. Others discover that their careers follow them wherever they go, waiting patiently for the moment when their skills are needed again. Jack Reeves had spent 5 years being exactly the mountain hermit he'd wanted to become. But for 18 hours, he'd been Special Agent Reeves again, and the mountains had learned what the cartels had discovered over 23 years of federal service. When you're hunting Jack Reeves, you'd better make sure he's not hunting you first. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone who seemed to be living a quiet, simple life, only to discover they were carrying extraordinary experience and skills that could emerge when needed most? Share their story in the comments. Tell us what city you're watching from. And if you think stories like this deserve to be told, hit that subscribe button and help us honor the quiet guardians who've served their country and continue to protect others, even in retirement. Because at True Human Tales, we believe that heroism doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it chops wood, tends gardens, and lives peacefully in the mountains. But it's always ready when the innocent need protecting. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.